What happens when a CEO buys a sandwich at his own diner, and here's something that makes him stop cold. Michael Carter, the CEO and founder of Carter's Grill, a beloved local diner chain with 18 locations, had spent years turning his dream into reality. Known for its welcoming atmosphere and high-comfort food, Carter's Grill had always been a second home for many families. But lately, troubling signs had begun to surface. Customer complaints about rude service and disorganized staff were growing, and once loyal employees were quietly quitting. His district managers insisted it was just growing pains, but the rumors told a different story. Determined decided to go undercover, he walked into one of his flagship diners, ordered a simple sandwich, and prepared to observe. But just as he was about to pay, he overheard two cashiers talking, and what they said made him freeze in place. From what he discovered in the next 4 hours would shake him to his core. The security cameras hadn't caught it. The management reports hadn't flagged it, but behind the polished counters of his beloved diner, the lunch rush at Carter's Diner was chaos in motion. Plates clattered as waitresses juggled full trays. A line of customers snaked toward the door, and shouts from the kitchen blended with the hum of chattering patrons. In the middle of it all, Henry moved in quiet contrast to the energy surrounding him. His hands, rough and calloused from decades of labor, neatly rinsed and stacked plates with a precision that almost seemed out of. He never faltered, never rushed, never let the chaotic rhythm of the diner rattle him. Instead, he worked with a steady calm, his focus fully on the task in front of him. Henry wasn't the type of man who commanded attention, and for many who came and went from the diner, he was invisible. For the staff, he was just Henry, the dishwasher, a man in his 70s who had been there longer than most of them had been alive. He had a wiry frame, the kind that suggested a life of hard work and crow's feet that deepened when he smiled, which was often. Yet his body betrayed him in ways his face did not. He winced if he bent too quickly, and when he thought no one was looking, he'd rub his lower back as if trying to smooth away the years of strain. Customers who noticed him at all called him by name, and he always had a warm word or a small nod in return. He was kind, they'd say later if asked, or quiet, but not many considered him beyond that moment of interaction. It was easy to overlook him, blending into the background as someone quietly folding napkins or stacking freshly washed silverware. His kindness had a subtlety to it, a way of slipping through the cracks without asking for acknowledgement. But those small acts told a larger story. During one busy afternoon, a young mother stood near the register, juggling her toddler and a tray of hastily ordered food. As she fumbled for her wallet, her face flushed with worry as the cashier repeated the total. Her voice wavered as she told the cashier she might need to put something back. Without hesitation, Henry stepped forward. His gait was slow and deliberate as he approached Megan. The cashier sliding a few folded bills out of his pocket, he leaned in and handed them over without ceremony. Megan glanced at him with a raised eyebrow, muttered something under her breath, and took the money. The mother stammered out a thank you, clutching her tray and her child as if holding on to a piece of her dignity. Henry didn't wait for acknowledgement. He returned to his post near the kitchen, washing trays of grimy dishes as though nothing remarkable had happened. That moment might have gone unnoticed by most, but it wasn't the first time he had done something like that. To Henry, it seemed small gestures were nothing extraordinary, but to others they were lifelines. Yet there was more to Henry than the simple impressions he left behind. Those kind words and quiet acts of generosity hinted at a deeper story, one not readily apparent to those around him. The truth of his situation might have surprised even the most perceptive observer. What few realized was the weight Henry carried long after his shift ended. At 72, he lived alone in a battered trailer on the edge of town, its once bright siding dull with age. Its windows leaked in the winter, its floors creaked with every step, and the roof needed patching long before the last few storms blew through. It was all that remained after years of financial strain. Henry's late wife, Margaret, had battled illness for the better part of a decade before she passed, leaving him with stacks of medical bills he could never quite climb out from under. His Social Security barely covered the essentials, and his part-time hours at the diner were what kept food in his fridge and gas in his rusty-like pickup truck. None of this, however, showed in the diner. He kept his chin up, his demeanor steady. If the burden weighed on him, he didn't let it seep into his work. He gave everything to the same tasks day in and day out, even when no one seemed to notice. The mother he discreetly helped that afternoon couldn't have known any of this. As she gathered her children and left the diner, she threw him a look of gratitude, even stopping briefly to thank him again before stepping out the door. Her thank you lingered in the air for a moment before Henry nodded slightly, offering her the same quiet smile he gave everyone. She wouldn't have realized that the few dollars he passed to Megan had likely been earmarked for his own groceries. But Henry seemed unbothered, already lost again in the rhythm of scrubbing and stacking the next set of plates. It wasn't just customers who received the steady kindness Henry had to give. Over time, he had become a silent thread in the fabric of the diner itself, connecting the people and the place even when others barely noticed. And yet, not everyone saw his kindness as a strength. To Henry's co-workers Troy and Megan, his behavior was something else entirely, a sign of weakness. Their disdain for him had grown louder in recent weeks, turning sharper and meaner. Whenever they thought he couldn't hear, they mocked him, and slowly their remarks began to carry something darker. The way they talked about Henry made it clear they had little respect for what he did or who he was. To them, he was just the old guy washing dishes, someone easy to push around, someone who would never push back. They dismissed his quiet acts as laughable, even irritating. Troy, the younger of the two, would roll his eyes at Henry's insistence on escorting elderly customers to the parking lot or refilling coffee cups without being asked. Megan, meanwhile, had started smirking when he struggled to carry heavy crates or worked late without complaint. Together, they had turned their frustration with him into something almost personal, and soon their mocking wasn't enough. They wanted to do more. But despite their efforts to chip away at him, Henry never wavered. He kept working, kept showing the same patience and generosity he always had. However, the subtle tension in the air was beginning to shift. The diner, for all its warmth and familiarity, was hiding an undercurrent of something more dangerous, something that not even Henry's kindness could smooth over entirely. The question wasn't if things could come to a head, it was what stood out most about Henry was how, even in the face of quiet ridicule, he remained unshaken. But what made a man like him a target for behavior so cruel? And what would it take for someone to step forward and defend him, or for him to defend himself? The answers weren't clear yet, but it was impossible to ignore the growing rift between Henry's quiet decency and Troy and Megan's brewing contempt. As the days passed, the walls of the diner seemed to hold a heavier kind of silence when the lunch rush faded. What seemed at first like a typical small-town workplace now felt more like a powder keg waiting for a spark. Behind their easy smiles and routine tasks, people like Troy and Megan were harboring intentions that could upend not just Henry's world, but the fragile balance of the diner itself. And quietly, unnoticed in the background, Michael Carter was taking it all in. Troy leaned against the counter near the register, tapping his fingers impatiently while Megan counted the cash drawer for their mid-shift check. It wasn't unusual to find the two of them stationed there, exchanging sarcastic remarks or animated whispers that often ended in suppressed laughter. To anyone walking through the diner, they looked like ordinary co-workers practically sheltered, but behind their grins and casual demeanor, there was an edge to their conversations. Troy and Megan didn't just share workplace gripes or swap mindless gossip. Their shared frustrations ran deeper, zeroing in on a specific target. "They're probably sending sympathy cards with these checks at this point," Megan said as she slid a stack of bills into the drawer. Troy smirked and gave a mock imitation of an older man's hunch, exaggerating a limp as he walked toward the kitchen doorway. Without even looking, Megan knew or rather who, he was mocking. Still carrying those crates like he doesn't have arthritis in both knees, huh? She added flatly. Henry hadn't noticed any of this, too busy rinsing trays piled with plates from the late morning breakfast rush. If he heard their quiet laughter or caught their glances in his direction, he never showed it. That only fueled their behavior. For Troy, Henry's kindness and humility weren't endearing, they were irritating. It baffled him how someone could do so much for so little recognition. To Megan, it was even worse than irritating. It felt performative, like Henry wanted everyone to see him as some kind of saint while she and Troy got stuck doing the work that really mattered. Their cynicism wasn't subtle. Troy often made comments loud enough to carry, like calling Henry the guest of honor whenever customers thanked him for refueling their coffee or suggesting he was auditioning for the Employee of the Decade award. After one of his quiet acts of generosity, Megan, meanwhile, found more subtle ways to express her disdain. She would leave heavy stacks of plates or ask Henry to check items in the walk-in freezer, knowing it would take him twice as long as it would any of their younger coworkers. When he silently did what she asked without complaint, she'd shrug it off as proof that he didn't mind, even if it was obvious to everyone else that he was struggling. It didn't take long for their frustrations to turn into something more deliberate. Over lunch one afternoon, Troy leaned close to Megan at the break room table and lowered his voice. "I swear if we don't get some turnover in this place, I'm gonna lose it. I know someone who needs a dishwasher job. My cousin's looking, and he'd kill for minimum wage plus tips." "Henry's not going anywhere," Megan replied, crumbling the wrapper of her sandwich into a tight ball. "Unless," she trailed off, the unsaid words hanging in the air between them. Troy raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to elaborate. "Unless someone gives management a reason to think he should," she added, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. That was the beginning of a plan, one that would grow more specific and brazen as the days went on. For the first few shifts, it was something they discussed in hypotheticals, trading ideas in private moments while the rest of the staff rushed past during peak hours. Soon those hypotheticals turned into actions. They started small. Troy would take extra change when customers paid cash, slipping quarters or singles into his pocket. When counts ran short at the end of Megan's shifts, she would shrug and suggest it was a mistake. "I mean, who else could it be?" she'd say with an exaggerated shrug, pointing out that Henry was around the register more often than most other employees, even though he rarely touched payments. It wasn't an accusation, not yet, but enough to plant a seed. If Henry quietly overheard her remarks or noticed the pointed glances she shot across the kitchen, he never responded. Troy, more brazen than Megan, took it further. He repeatedly logged suspicious refunds into the register, tying them to transactions that coincidentally happened during Henry's shifts. Meanwhile, Megan encouraged waitresses to keep an eye on Henry, pointing out innocuous habits she framed as suspicious. How he always seemed to check leftover tips on tables before leaving for the night. At first, their coworkers didn't seem to buy into the narrative. Henry, after all, had never given anyone a reason to doubt his honesty. But repetition has a way of breaking down reason. When coins went missing or shortages showed up in the drawers, Megan's dismissive must be harder not to consider. But what drove their behavior wasn't complicated. Troy hated waiting. He convinced himself that if Henry weren't taking up that dishwashing slot, his cousin would have been hired weeks ago. And Megan couldn't stand what Henry reminded her of. How little she cared about the diner compared to the pride he seemed to take in even the smallest details. It made her feel exposed, like Henry's quiet dedication was a mirror reflecting her half-hearted work. To call them power-hungry would have been too generous. They wanted control, yes, but only as long as it served their convenience. Studies show toxic behaviors stem, more often than not, from ambition misdirected by insecurity. In environments like this, where employees vie for recognition or better shifts, bullying creates a hierarchy that tries to elevate one person by breaking another. Troy and Megan's laughter sometimes veiled their bitterness, but the subtle drumbeat of their resentment increased Attila dominated their action, and in this case their target was a man who wouldn't fight back. Their plan, dangerous as it was, didn't slip by unnoticed. Though most staff didn't connect the dots or dig too deeply into discrepancies in the register, not everyone was as unaware as Troy and Megan assumed. Behind the scenes, someone was observing more than they realized. Michael Carter, though disguised at the moment simply as Mike, a shy and infrequent customer, had started to see the patterns forming, even if he didn't yet have proof of where the money was going. What he did know, leaning back in his seat near the far corner of the diner, was this: something didn't feel right. He had been coming to this location for over a week, long enough to recognize that the team's rhythm was off. The careless comments from some, the quiet discomfort of others, even the way employees seemed to cluster together in small groups whenever tensions mounted, painted a picture of a workplace where resentment simmered below the surface. And he couldn't ignore how often Henry was the subject of their whispers. Michael had built his business on values he thought would unite a team, not fracture it. Yet as he sat there, watching his employees work, the disconnect between the ideal and the reality unsettled him. It wasn't just about the money missing from the register, or the mocking remarks tossed casually in Henry's direction. It was the culture behind it, the kind of environment that allowed it to brew unnoticed until now. For now, Michael remained silent, blending easily into the flow of the diner. But in the back of his mind, plans were forming. He wasn't just watching and waiting. He was gathering the pieces he'd need to do more than confront the issue. Troy and Megan's confidence, obvious in the way they smirked when around Henry, was about to be their downfall. Michael had seen enough to know there was more going on than he could prove without taking action himself. The question wasn't whether he would intervene, it was how, and when it came time, he was certain there would be no mistaking his decision. Michael Carter sat at the far end of the counter, nursing a cup of coffee and picking at a turkey sandwich he didn't really want. His plain jeans and faded baseball cap kept him hidden in plain sight, making him just another face in the lunch crowd. He had been coming to this diner for about a week now, long enough to recognize the rhythm of the staff and see where it faltered. On the surface, the operation didn't look bad. Orders were going out, tables were turning over, and customers seemed content enough. But the more time he spent observing, the more cracks he noticed, tiny at first but impossible to ignore as time went on. This wasn't what Michael had envisioned when he first opened Carter's Grill nearly 2 decades ago. Back then, it was just a single location, the kind of cozy space with checkered floors and rotating pies in the display that made people feel at home. He had built the business from those humble beginnings, expanding slowly, always insisting that the culture of the diner mattered just as much as the food on the plate. But as Carter's Grill grew, Michael had realized he couldn't be everywhere at once. He started relying on managers to uphold those values while he stayed at arm's length, focused on expansion rather than day-to-day operations. Over time, though, that distance had eroded something fundamental. Reports of employee dissatisfaction and a spike in turnover had prompted him to act. Now, sitting here, watching his employees from behind the shield of anonymity, Michael was beginning to understand just how deep the disconnect ran. From the moment he saw Henry, something about the old man struck him. Henry's pace was unhurried but purposeful, his focus unbroken by the chaos swirling around him. Most of the customers didn't notice him, but Michael did. Every time Henry carried a polished tray to the racks or bent down to retrieve a fallen utensil, his efficiency stood out. Yet, as Michael kept watching, he saw something beyond Henry's work. It was the way Henry interacted with people one-on-one, the quiet smile he offered a server rushing past, the calmness he maintained even when a pile of plates toppled onto the counter near him. There was steadiness in the old man that no one else seemed to match. Michael would later think it was what drew Troy and Megan's attention, and with it, their disdain. Megan's voice carried across the counter one shift as she counted out change for a customer. Michael noticed the thinly veiled annoyance in her tone as she responded to another employee asking for help with a particularly messy table in the corner. "Maybe we should pull Henry off dishes," she muttered just loud enough for the others nearby to hear. "Since apparently we run this place as a charity now." She glanced at Troy, who smirked in silent agreement as he leaned against a wall near the register. The remark landed lightly, almost like a joke, but Michael caught the meaning behind it. He saw the knowing look Troy gave Megan, and the subtle undercurrent of their shared contempt. Every shift Michael observed followed the same pattern. These two kept the energy around them sharp and unfriendly, while Henry remained quietly diligent, never snapping or responding to their petty provocation. One afternoon, as Michael sipped his coffee, he saw a moment that would stick with him. It wasn't loud or dramatic, just a quiet exchange, but it showed how damaged the culture in the restaurant had become. A mother juggling two young children lingered near the register, fumbling with her wallet as the cashier rang up her order. She seemed flustered, her child tugging at her shirt, while a line of customers grew behind her. Michael noticed Megan shoot her a look, barely concealed impatience for holding things up. Before anything came of it, Henry appeared. He stepped forward with a deliberate slowness, reached into his back pocket, and handed over a crumpled $10 bill. The woman hesitated for a moment before taking it, murmuring a quick thank you as she gathered her things and shuffled her children out the door. Henry walked back to the dish station like nothing had happened. Megan just rolled her eyes, muttering, "Guess even martyrs have to show off sometimes," as her fingers hovered over the till. Moments like these came into sharper focus for Michael with each passing shift. He began piecing together how toxic behavior had crept into the cracks left behind by his absence. Troy and Megan weren't working in a vacuum. They had influence, however small, over the tone of the workplace. Their ongoing ridicule of Henry created invisible ripples that affected the mood of everyone else working there. Some employees laughed uncomfortably to fit in, others maintained their distance entirely, unwilling to intervene but equally unwilling to participate. All this took place under the radar, unnoticed by the district managers who popped in once a month to review paperwork and walk over checklists. Any reports Michael might have read before going undercover lacked the context that casual observation revealed so easily. It was then, in the quiet moments of watching, that Michael began to understand something crucial. Absentee management didn't just mean managers being physically elsewhere. It also meant leadership failing to set an example strong enough to echo in their absence. Loyal employees like Henry could only maintain so much positivity in an environment where resentment and cruelty were allowed to grow unchecked. By handing off the responsibility of overseeing the diner to others and focusing solely on expansion, Michael had unwittingly created a culture where employees like Troy and Megan could take root and thrive without him even realizing it. Michael couldn't shake an unsettled feeling as he slipped out of the diner one afternoon, leaving a tip big enough to avoid drawing attention, but small enough to remain inconspicuous. He had seen enough to know a fundamental truth. This wasn't just a couple of bad apples. It went deeper than that. The tone and values he thought his brand stood for were nowhere to be found in this place. When he looked around the diner, it didn't feel like something he had built. It felt like something that had grown wild in his absence. And yet, for all the negativity he had uncovered, there was a spark of hope in Henry. What Michael saw in Henry wasn't just hard work or quiet kindness. It was resilience unshaken by the thoughtlessness of others, and it made Michael wonder how many others like Henry might have slipped away from his company unnoticed. But it wasn't time for action yet. Michael still needed more, a way to illuminate the truth that wouldn't just confront individuals but expose the culture itself. In the following days, he began planning. He wasn't sure what form his intervention would take, but one thing was certain. Troy and Megan's harmful behavior wasn't going to go unchecked for much longer. They didn't realize they were being watched, which gave him all the time he needed to find the cracks he could widen into daylight. With the pieces slowly falling into place, Michael prepared to take his next step. The tension at the diner lingered, unresolved, as the days played out in the same cruel cycle. But it wouldn't last. The evidence was piling up, and soon there would be no way for Troy and Megan to deny what they had done. Michael Carter sat at his desk late into the evening, the diner's daily chatter replaced by the hum of a portable air conditioner in his office. In his hands were receipts, registered logs, and a list of shifts from the weeks he had spent observing the diner undercover. As he went over each detail, the frustration simmered beneath. He had suspected that aspects of the diner's culture had gone unchecked, but seeing the breadth of the issue laid out on paper and in person during his time as Mike cemented how drastically he had to act. The more he replayed scenes in his mind, workers whispering at registers, side glances exchanged as Henry shuffled by, and quiet smirks tinged with malice, the clearer it wasn't just about Troy and Megan anymore. It was about everyone who stood by and let them continue unchallenged. He needed proof, irrefutable and unfiltered, before confronting them openly. Next week, Michael set his plan into motion. Hidden cameras were discreetly installed throughout the diner, positioned so they could monitor both the kitchen area and the front counter. The cameras weren't fancy, just small and easily overlooked, but their positioning was deliberate. One captured the register, another focused on the break room corner, and a third unobtrusively overlooked the dishwashing station. Employees carried on oblivious as the footage quietly ran in the background. Michael took care to keep his involvement in the diner during this time as ordinary as possible. He continued visiting as Mike, ordering coffee, tipping over generously on modest meals, and occasionally blending into the lunch crowd for hours at a time. It didn't take long for the cameras to confirm what Michael had already suspected. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, he sat in his home office, reviewing the first batch of footage. As he watched, the pieces of Troy and Megan's cruel game came together. It wasn't just the mocking remarks, though there were plenty of those caught in snippets of audio and casual gestures of exaggerated annoyance whenever Henry walked by. It was the precise way they timed their manipulations, choosing quieter hours to skim from the till or log false refunds when fewer employees were paying attention. Michael froze the video when, after carefully pocketing a handful of bills, Troy leaned on the back counter and muttered to Megan, "Henry's sloppiness is finally paying off." Her faint laughter was followed by a derisive snort as she adjusted the cash drawer. As the recordings piled up, Michael saw more. He saw Megan deliberately leave open the break room till, later claiming aloud that it had been Henry's mistake, and insinuating to a handful of co-workers that he had taken money. He listened to Troy talk up his cousin's supposed qualifications in hushed tones. What struck him most, though, wasn't their attempts to cover their tracks. It was how often they degraded Henry while he stood just feet away, unaware or perhaps tuning it out entirely. "What a waste," Troy muttered one evening after sneaking a few dollars into his pocket, tilting his chin in Henry's direction. "Can't believe they pay him to stand there and look old." Michael's hands tightened into fists as he fast-traversed through more footage. Every instance of Henry's actions, refueling coffee without being asked, quietly helping customers, or lugging dish crates twice his recommended weight, seemed to exist outside the toxic bubble Troy and Megan created. And yet, these actions were what Henry, their scapegoat. Each small act of condomness became ammunition in the false narrative they tried to spin about his performance. By the time Michael had reviewed all the footage, he knew he didn't need more. The cameras hadn't just caught enough evidence to prove Troy and Megan's wrongdoing. It had painted a damning portrait of the diner's atmosphere itself, and how it allowed toxicity to fester almost unnoticed. The confrontation came near the end of a particularly busy lunch shift. The diner was packed with afternoon regulars, construction workers on their breaks, young mothers with their toddlers, and elderly couples sharing early meals. Energy hummed as plates clattered, and the kitchen scrambled to keep pace. Michael had stepped out briefly to his car, returning in plain view instead of clad in business casual attire and carrying an envelope. His entrance seemed to catch no one's attention except one, Megan's, whose eyes widened slightly before narrowing in suspicion. She whispered something sharply to Troy, just as Michael made his way toward the counter. He placed the envelope on the countertop with a deliberate motion. Standing in front of both Troy and Megan, Michael surveyed the room, noticing how the other staff members seemed to pause briefly, sensing tension in the air. It wasn't until he cleared his throat, projecting his voice firmly but not loudly enough to cause a scene, that the attention of nearby customers began turning in their direction. "I think it's time we settled something that's been going on in this diner for far too long," he said simply, pulling out a thin sheaf of papers from the envelope. The room was uncomfortably quiet now. Michael had always been composed, careful with his words, and measured in his movements, but there was sharpness behind his expression this time, a weight in his tone that cut through even the thrumming sounds of the kitchen. He unfolded one of the papers and held it up briefly to indicate its importance. "I've spent the past few weeks observing this place, reviewing its operations, and looking into certain—" He didn't name them right away. Instead, he turned slightly toward the floor staff gathered nearby, capturing their momentum of curiosity, before settling his gaze again on Troy and Megan. "It seems," Michael continued, "there's been some theft in this diner. But the only theft occurring here has been perpetrated by the very people making accusations." His words hit like dropped plates, moments frozen among the stillness of workers shifting uncomfortably yet unable to look away. He motioned toward a nearby screen where he had set up footage to play the recordings taken by the hidden cameras now shed daylight on every false refuma. Every necked, by this time shed daylight on every false refum. Every pocketed bill now shed daylight on every false refuma. Heavy sighs rocked Cat, motioned for an interruption. Every neck. Regan's arms crossed defensively as the scenes flickered on screen. Troy shifted from foot to foot, each reel a hand digging subtly into the register, a murmur about Henry not noticing, forcing the weight of their denials to collapse under the sheer somber wall of evidence. The quiet murmur of onlooking staff's clients, before Michael raised his hand gently to silence any chatter among observing workers or unnerved patrons now gathered. The footage transitioned mid-Michael, directly emphasized shifts in wrongdoing, small rundown Henry endured. Shift ending conversation transition for unorganized loyalty approach, redeployment's dusty trend. The first thing Michael did after dismissing Troy and Megan was call a staff meeting. His tone was clear but not aggressive, setting the stage for the changes he intended to make. The dismissal of the toxic employees wasn't meant to just remove a problem. It was a signal to the rest of the team. Moving forward, he told them, the diner would be more than a workplace. It would become a space where every employee felt respected and supported. He acknowledged his failings as an absentee leader and took full responsibility for letting the environment deteriorate. For many listening, it was the first time they had heard a business owner admit fault so directly. But for Michael, this was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. Within a week, Henry was promoted. It wasn't a simple gesture or a symbolic move. Michael genuinely believed that Henry represented the kind of values the diner had strayed from. As operations manager, Henry's responsibilities expanded from his familiar role in the kitchen to ensuring that employees were treated fairly and that morale stayed high. To some, the idea of a 72-year-old dishwasher moving into management felt unusual, but those who had worked alongside Henry understood why Michael had chosen him. Few could deny his quiet authority, the way his consistency and sense of care quietly set an example even when no one was giving him credit. Years of balancing grace and grit had made him more than qualified to take on a leadership role. Michael also addressed the broader issues that had allowed the toxic culture to take root in the first place. Pay at Carter's Diner, like many similar establishments, had always met bare minimum standards, something Michael knew he had to change if he wanted employees to feel valued. He announced that effective immediately, all staff would receive a living wage not just competitive with the region, but enough to help workers build stability and avoid the kind of hardships Henry had endured. Medical benefits, which had previously been limited to managers, were now available to even part-time employees, including dental and mental health coverage. "This is about more than a paycheck," he explained during the announcement. "It's about making sure people know this company values them as human beings first." The most talked about change, however, was the creation of the Henry Lawson Community Fund. Named in honor of Henry, the fund was designed to help employees facing financial emergencies, whether that meant unexpected medical bills, urgent home repairs, or other challenges. It was seeded by Michael himself, with a significant portion of the profits from Carter's diner locations redirected into a pool that employees could apply to when in need. The fund was also open to small donations from customers, some of whom had already begun contributing as soon as they heard about it. The first official withdrawal from the fund happened quietly a few weeks later, when a server used it to pay for her daughter's orthodontic procedure. Word spread quickly among the team, and while the server never announced it herself, her gratitude showed through in subtle ways: more patience with coworkers, more warmth toward customers. The fund wasn't just about money, it was about creating an invisible safety net that made employees feel less alone. Reforming the diner's culture, however, wasn't as simple as raising wages or removing Troy and Megan. The attitudes that had led to their behavior lingered in quieter, less obvious ways among the remaining staff. Some employees were skeptical of Michael's sudden involvement, questioning whether his promises would stick or if it was all for show. Others struggled to adjust to the new expectations of mutual respect, finding it uncomfortable to receive feedback when they had resisted accountability in the past. Changing a workplace that had long tolerated dismissiveness required more than policy changes. It demanded time, consistency, and a relentless commitment to reinforcing the new values. To address this, Michael established regular one-on-one meetings with staff to hear their concerns directly and ensure they felt heard. It was during one of these meetings that a line cook, who had rarely spoken up before, admitted that she had nearly quit because of the hostile environment created by Troy and Megan. "I stayed because of Henry," she said simply. "Even when things were bad, he made it feel like someone cared." Feedback like this only reinforced Michael's belief that employees didn't just need fair wages. They needed leaders who actively listened and stepped in when things went wrong. Henry, in his new role, played a key part in helping smooth over the awkward transition. Though he wasn't one for speeches or bold declarations, his presence around the diner carried weight. He treated the people around him with the same quiet respect he always had. But now it extended beyond subtle gestures. He started small initiatives, like organizing a staff lunch every month or quietly covering for servers struggling during busy shifts. When one of the younger cashiers came to him asking for advice on how to handle rude customers, Henry shared what he'd learned from decades of dealing with all kinds of people. "Patience fixes more than anyone thinks," he told her, his voice calm but firm. It was advice that could have applied not just to customers but to the staff as a whole. The response to the changes Michael implemented came slowly at first but steadily grew over time. Employees who had once kept to themselves began an open up during breaks, sharing more of their lives without the fear of judgment that had previously defined the diner's atmosphere. A server who had once been withdrawn began taking it upon herself to check in with her coworkers, offering to swap shifts when someone was having a rough week. A dishwasher who had been on the edge of quitting stayed on, eventually training to learn new skills in the kitchen. These weren't grand transformations, but they were tangible signs of a team beginning to trust each other again. The customers noticed a shift too, though not all at once. Those who frequented the diner started commenting on how the staff seemed lighter, less hurried, more willing to linger briefly at tables to chat about someone's day. They didn't know the details behind the change, but they could feel it in their interactions. Some even went out of their way to donate to the community fund, knowing that it wasn't just charity, it was a direct way to support the people who made the diner feel like home. To Michael, the most powerful change wasn't the logistics or the policies, but the way employees rallied around Henry. Once the quiet, overlooked figure in the kitchen, he had become a symbol of resilience and integrity. When his promotion was officially announced, the staff pooled their tips to surprise him with a new toolbox, knowing he used his off days to make repairs to his aging trailer. The gesture left Henry speechless, for once unable to summon the usual quiet nod or small thank you. Instead, he stood surrounded by his co-workers, each of them cheering not just for his new title but for what he stood for. The belief that decency and hard work still mattered, even when no one else seemed to notice. Michael knew the work was far from over. Changing the culture of a business wasn't something that could happen overnight, and it certainly wasn't something that could be maintained without consistent effort. But as he watched the employees gather around Henry during a late shift one evening, laughing over shared memories and making plans for the weekend, he felt a quiet assurance. The toxicity that had once festered here was gone now, not banished, but outshined by something bigger. It wasn't just Henry's kindness that had sparked the transformation. It was the way his kindness reminded everyone else of what they could be if they chose to care. And so, the diner operated not just as it always had, but as something greater, a rare glimpse of a workplace not just rebuilt but redeemed. What happens when a business becomes a force for good? For Carter's Diner, that transformation didn't come from a shiny new advertising campaign or a corporate-driven initiative. It came from a single decision, one that required Michael to not only confront the truth about his diner, but to reimagine what it could be. After Troy and Megan were dismissed and the changes were put into place, the impact of those decisions could be seen everywhere. From the lunch crowd that packed the booths, to the sense of camaraderie among the staff that Michael had once feared might never return. Henry, now officially titled as the operations manager, sat at a corner booth one morning, balancing a clipboard on his lap as he scribbled notes about inventory for the week. A server passed by carrying a tray of steaming breakfast plates and paused briefly to ask Henry about her upcoming schedule. Henry listened intently, offering a reassuring reply before returning to his notes. Moments like this made the difference. Henry's presence wasn't just about overseeing the daily operations, it was about setting a tone, one that reminded everyone around him that this was no longer just a job to push through. It could be so much more than that. Michael didn't deny the risks involved in prioritizing people over profits. The decision to increase wages, provide benefits, and establish the Henry Lawson Community Fund came with upfront costs. Tightening already lean profit margins in a business like this wasn't something he had done lightly. For years, the metrics of success had been about tables served and revenue numbers. Shifting focus to employee well-being felt, at first, like a gamble. But the rewards that followed weren't abstract. Employees who might have once eyed the clock, counting down the minutes of their shift, now lingered after hours to help one another close or plan for the week ahead. The improved morale translated directly into better service for customers. Complaints about staff rudeness or inattentiveness disappeared altogether. Instead, customers praised the diner for its welcoming atmosphere and noted how much happier the employees seemed, compared to just months prior. At the heart of this turnaround was the community fund. The Henry Lawson Community Fund, Michael had explained to his employees during its announcement, isn't charity. It's a reminder that we're here for each other no matter what. The fund offered interest-free financial assistance to team members during times of crisis. Whether it was unexpected medical bills, car repairs, or even housing emergencies, employees could apply without judgment. The first request came 2 weeks after the fund's launch. A line cook had been hit with an emergency dental bill for his wife, an amount he wouldn't have been able to cover without draining his savings. Nervous at first, he quietly approached Henry about applying. By the end of the week, his need was met, and he walked into work visibly relieved. No big announcements were made, but word spread quickly among the team. The quiet support system that Michael had envisioned was taking root. Beyond its immediate impact, the fund became a symbolic reminder of why the changes mattered. It reflected a shift in focus from seeing employees as replaceable parts of an operation to valuing them as the core of what made the diner successful. Michael began seeing something he hadn't planned for. The staff started contributing to the fund on their own, pooling tips or offering small weekly amounts from their paychecks to grow its revenue. Customers, too, caught wind of the fund's purpose and occasionally tossed in donations, knowing their money would directly help the staff that treated them like family. One regular, an older woman who came in every Friday for pancakes, even left a small note with her contribution, "For whatever Henry thinks is right." When Michael agreed to name the fund after Henry, he hadn't fully realized how much it would resonate, but it was fitting. Henry's quiet gestures had always been what set him apart, and now those gestures weren't just occasional moments of kindness. They were the foundation for a system that uplifted others in meaningful ways. During his first official meeting as manager, Henry told the staff, "It's not about how much someone helps at once, it's about how much they show up and care in the long run." It wasn't a speech meant to impress, but to Michael, the words lingered as a simple truth. They perfectly described the spirit of the changes at Carter's Diner. What made the transformation of the diner so striking wasn't just that things were better. It was that something rare had taken hold, a shared sense of pride among the employees in a place they could finally call their own. Michael realized how drastically things had shifted one evening when he stopped by unexpectedly during a dinner rush. The workers on shift, none of whom had recognized him months before when he was in disguise, now greeted him by name. The typically stressful atmosphere of peak hours buzzed with energy, but it lacked the tension that had once followed Troy and Megan around like a storm cloud. While customers laughed and dug into their meals, Michael overheard a cashier offer to cover a dishwasher's break and a line cook ribbing Henry outside the Pasluck idea might be. Everything felt, for the first time in years, effortless in the best way. The larger lesson wasn't lost on Michael. For years he had seen leadership as a matter of delegation, pushing responsibilities down the line. It took stepping into anonymity and witnessing his business from the ground level to realize how deeply personal leadership had to be. The long-term benefits of treating employees well aren't just financial, he would later tell a business conference. They're cultural. You can't buy loyalty. You earn it piece by piece until one day it becomes the core of what your brand stands for. The diner's reduced turnover rates and improved customer loyalty proved that this shift wasn't just ethical, it was smart. But outside the workings of the team itself, the community fund provided evidence that businesses could extend their impact beyond the walls they operated within. A young server named Danielle used the fund to buy textbooks for her college classes. An older busser named Malik relied on it when the furnace in his apartment broke during one of the coldest weeks of the year. These stories weren't publicized, but they rippled through the diner quietly, strengthening the ties between employees who started to see each other less as coworkers and more as a tight-knit group. Perhaps the most telling change was the way the staff rallied around new employees. It became a tradition to assign incoming workers a guide during their first week, someone to mentor them through the rhythm of the diner. Henry took this concept seriously. He started spending part of every week coaching a younger cashier on ways to handle difficult, for busy shifts. "He taught me how to care about what I'm doing," one server joked, half serious when asked about Henry during a busy Thursday shift. Not just the work, but the people. The tension of those earlier months, when the diner seemed like a fragile ship barely afloat, had given way to something stronger than Michael ever expected. The changes weren't dramatic all at once. They were built out of small choices that accumulated steadily, each one reinforcing the belief that compassion wasn't a luxury for businesses, it was the foundation for their success. Amazon stood near the counter one evening, watching Henry lean in to show a young dishwasher the proper way to load heavy plates without hurting his back. He felt a quiet certainty. The values that had saved the diner weren't just practiced, they were embodied, day after day, by the man who had been there all along. Character, not position, defines true worth. Henry's actions, though quiet and often unnoticed, carried more power than any title ever could. His compassion, whether helping a struggling mother or easing tensions among co-workers, set an example that transformed an entire workplace. It wasn't grand speeches or dramatic gestures, but small, consistent acts that created lasting change. Think about your own workplace. What culture are you shaping through your actions? Are you fostering accountability, fairness, and compassion, or letting something toxic take root? The smallest kindnesses build foundations stronger than any policy or profit margin. Perhaps, like Henry, your actions could inspire a transformation waiting to happen.